My name is Loren Schoenberg, and as we start, just to introduce Ben Webster, some folks know who he is, and some might be tuning in just knowing that he's a name they'd like to know more about. Ben Webster is one of the most original jazz musicians of all time. The sound of an instrumentalist. It's like the sound of someone's voice, I guess, when someone calls you on the telephone and they don't have to say who it is. There have been so many, hundreds of thousands, millions, however many jazz musicians that there have been since Ben Webster passed away. How many are there, that you can hear two or three notes of and know immediately who it is? Well, Ben Webster was one of those originals. And we're going to be looking into his early years today and getting him right up and into the Duke Ellington band, where he really became internationally famous. So let's start. And the best way to start is with some music. We're going to address the musical question, who is Ben Webster? But I think it's probably better to let Ben Webster introduce himself. So we'll listen to the two sides of Ben, the beautiful ballad player and the hot and fiery swinger, in this incredible clip from 1959. I'll tell you who you'll be hearing. Hank Jones on the piano, George Duvivier on the bass, and Joe Jones on the drums. And on the second tune, Ben in the rhythm section is joined by Vic Dickinson on trombone and Buck Clayton on the trumpet. So here is Ben Webster.
Webster now, and Chelsea Bridge by Billy Strayhorn. Hank Jones piano, Ben Webster tenor saxophone, George Duvivier bass, Joe Jones drums, Buck Clayton trumpet, and Vic Dickinson trombone.
Jones on the piano. Sorry about that, folks. I think the video might be freezing up a little bit.
Ben Webster, Duke Ellington C Jam Blues.
So that's a great way to get into the question of who was Ben Webster, because we really kind of heard two different things there. We heard the beautiful ballad playing with that tone that's somewhere in between a cello and a violin, the gorgeously phrased, elegant. And then on the last song, he kind of went wild and raspy and almost sound like two different people. And he could do both. He could play ballads rough and he could play swing tunes smooth. But it's that kind of dichotomy in Ben Webster music that is so absolutely fascinating. Much more, it's much more pronounced than in most of the other giants. Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong mention it. They play a slow tune slower and a fast tune faster. But there's usually not that much a difference in tonal quality. That's a fascinating thing about Ben Webster. Well, here are the basic facts. Ben was born on March 27th, 1909 in Kansas City, Missouri, and he died in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, where he had been based for many years, on September 20th, 1973. So that means that he was only 64 years old when he passed. 1909 was a hell of a year for jazz musicians. I mean, so many great players were born then, starting with Benny Goodman and Lester Young, just for two, among many other giants born in 1909. And right in that time period, you get such a blossoming of, I guess I don't know whether you'd call it a second generation, but, the musicians who were, 8, 9, 10 years younger than Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, and who, when they came up, I guess had the advantage of picking up on what they had done and kind of furthering the jazz dialogue even a little bit further. Kansas City, Missouri was an absolutely fascinating place. It was going under exponential growth in the time. It was never a center of African-American culture, although it became known ultimately for some of the great bands and things that came out of there in the 20s and 30s, unlike Chicago, which was a major point of the great migration from the South to the North in the late 19th century up to the mid 20th century. Kansas City was usually only about 10 or 15% African-American, but it had a segregated area like most cities in America did back in those days. And it was a hotbed of creativity. Starting with Prohibition, Kansas City became, what was it called? The Paris of the West or something. It was much more than Paris, but in a sense, it was well known for beef and stockyards and cattle and all those kind of things. And a mayor, Tom Pendergast, who was one of those great H.L. Mencken-like, Upton Sinclair-like, Theodore Dreiser-like political bosses. And he controlled the Vice and the entertainment. And there was a lot of work and a lot of stuff going on in Kansas City. It's interesting that we're going to find out that the first major band that that Ben Webster played with was led by Benny Moten, and Benny Moten was the band leader of choice for the Pendergast regime in Chicago in the 20s going into the 30s. And you know who else was a product of the Pendergast regime? President Harry Truman. He wasn't president then. He was a haberdasher and then a local politician and then a national politician. So, it's not at all unlikely to think that Ben Webster and Harry Truman were in the same room at some point. Not necessarily such a big deal, but kind of fascinating. So who was Ben Webster? Now, Ben Webster he played the violin, he played the piano, and he was, by his own admission, like Duke Ellington in a certain kind of way, and almost Coleman Hawkins, the product of a middle-class family, spoiled. I mean, he said he was spoiled. I'm not saying that he was, but Ben Webster said he was spoiled as a child. His mother used to dress him up in fancy clothes, and anything he wanted, he could have. And he played the violin, and he famously said that he didn't like playing the violin because everyone said he was a sissy. There's a term of art for those days. And Ben was, wasn't that tall, but he was a big, even as a boy, a teenager, he was a big guy. And he certainly didn't like being called a sissy. It's probably there that he learned a little bit of fisticuffs. And he said that whenever his mother would go out and he was supposed to be practicing the violin, he would go to the piano. And he started falling in love with the kind of piano players that were in Kansas City at that time, jazz, boogie woogie, ragtime. He really kind of fell in love with that. And we're going to hear him play the piano. How about that? Some of this footage, I think they glommed it together. It's from a documentary called Big Ben that was made in the early 1970s. And some of it, if you look, he's actually playing, and some, I think they overdubbed something. But just to see him play the piano is a real treasure. And I also want to mention, and we'll mention this more explicitly later and tomorrow with part 2, that there are 2 excellent biographies of Ben Webster, one by Jerome de Valk and one by Frank Buchmann Mueller, both Europeans who wrote wonderful books on Ben, and I'm certainly indebted to them for a lot of this scholarship and even some of the pictures. And the more you want to get into Ben, you will undoubtedly want to check out those books. But in the meantime, here's Ben at the piano.
Still playing stride piano, so I thought maybe I'd put down a couple of tunes for you. Hope you enjoy this. Tell the governor to watch out. I'm on his back.
The governor is Duke Ellington.
Could have been better.
That wasn't me tapping along, by the way. That was actually on the soundtrack of the film. So you get to see him playing some stride there. Some of you might even have on some records, they actually issued little bits of Ben playing the piano, Roses of Picardy. It was one of those Verve record dates, 1956, 57. And he started just playing a little stride. And I remember that came out on a record years ago, and it was incredible just to hear him do it. And Ben Webster famously talked about how in later years, I guess, well, maybe also in his mid years, but when he was living kind of isolated from America, when he was over in Europe in the 60s going into the 70s, and he was kind of lonely for his old friends. Not that he didn't make friends there, some great musicians and some great records. But, you know, he missed the great stride pianists and I'm sure Harlem and LA and the places where he had lived. And he had a tape machine, and there's film of him doing this. In the morning, he'd put on a reel-to-reel tape machine, and it was nothing but Fats Waller and Art Tatum and Willie Lyon Smith and all those people. And so that was kind of like his getting up in the morning music. Some people listen to Haydn. Some people listen to all different kinds of music. And for Ben, it was the great stride pianist.
Still playing.
Oops, there we go. Now, big influence on Ben in these early days. So let's say he's born in 1909. He's going to leave Kansas City by 1928. So he would be 19. So somewhere in the mid 20s, 1925, 26, he's 16, 17 years old. He's playing the piano, and he discovers some of these great pianists who were mixing up blues and ragtime and what would be known as swing, just all different kinds of stuff, just as it was coming to a boil, so to speak, being created as a new forward-moving kind of thing. And one of the great, still kind of undersung figures of that music is the gentleman on the right, and that is Pete Johnson. And not only was Pete Johnson a big influence on Ben Webster's piano playing, and he later became well known as the first accompanist to Big Joe Turner and kind of a boogie woogie guy. But Pete Johnson was actually much more musically active than a lot of other folks. He could play not just in the boogie woogie style, Versatile, that's the word I was looking for. Count Basie said that he learned a lot from Pete Johnson. And I think when you listen to Count Basie on those early records, Jones Smith Incorporated, the early Basie records where he's playing a lot, I think we're hearing a lot of Pete Johnson there. Well, there are no recordings, naturally, of Ben as a teenager in Kansas City playing the piano and hanging out with Pete Johnson, but they were reunited 20 years later on a record date that was called Pete Johnson's Housewarming or Housekeeping. I'm sure someone out there right now could correct me, the exact title. Housewarming Party, I think that's what it was. And it was a series of 78s where a bunch of different musicians came in and played a tune with Pete Johnson as though they were at a party in someone's house. And Ben plays here. I have to mention that this recording and some of the others that we're going to hear, I have edited. And to some folks, that's a sin. You can hear all the original recordings. They're mostly on YouTube or on Amazon Music, or maybe you have them in your collection. But in the interest of time, for some of the things we're going to hear in this presentation, I've kind of narrowed it down to the Ben Webster parts, or the parts that are more relevant to the talk here. And of course, you can hear the whole recordings in any number of places. Here is most of something called Ben Rides Out. And it's Ben Webster along with the rhythm section featuring Pete Johnson on the piano. And I like to think, I have no idea, of course, but I like to think that 20 years later, they called this kind of slowish blues, and they were thinking maybe about when they met in Kansas City 20 years earlier and some of the little things that went back and forth at that time. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's some great music. That was really interesting to hear. That's a great shot of Ben on the left. For the most part, we're going chronologically here, but that photo is taken in the 1940s by Bill Gottlieb. It was taken on 52nd Street. And there he is playing a Selmer saxophone with an Otto Link mouthpiece. And you can just see that embouchure and those flared nostrils. That actually is a thing among saxophone players, and especially with Coleman Hawkins and his disciples. They were famous for that, which was to get more air. They would, their actually nostrils would, that was part of playing was, and to get more air in, to be able to play louder and more forcefully, or just breathe longer. And that look on Ben, that's, geez, that's a heck of a photo. And on the right, again, Pete Johnson. So Ben has not even really started playing the saxophone yet in 1926, 27, 28. And he's going to want to pick up the saxophone and start to learn to play just about the time that he leaves Kansas City in 1928. Let's go to the next slide here. Whoops, there we go. Here are just some of the bands that were big when Ben Webster was a teenager in Kansas City. I mean, it was a hell of a time. It was the 1920s. I think at that time they were already calling it the Jazz Age, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly jazz was, or what was thought to be jazz, was a huge, huge flavor in popular music. On the top, we really kind of have the established jazz band, African-American jazz band of Kansas City, and one that eventually was going to lead directly to the Count Basie band. And if you're not familiar with them, that is Benny Moten's Orchestra. And that is a great, great photo of the band. I would say around 1926, because the trumpet player Ed Lewis joined just a little bit later, and he is not there. But this is the band, and that's fascinating. I mean, look at the instruments. There's a mellophone on the ground there. There's the megaphone next to the trombone player. You know, they would play through the megaphone, sometimes also sing through them, but they did play through them, as did the clarinet players. In fact, Vince Giordano's band, I believe, still does that stuff, where they have a megaphone that goes into the bottom of a clarinet and you play it and it gets a really strange sound. And, you know, those things were important back in those days because it was pre-electric microphones for the great part. And there's the saxophone section, and you see a tuba back there. There's not even a bass at that point. And Benny Moten is by the piano. And it says Benny Moten's Victor Recording Orchestra. Victor Records was the label that Enrico Caruso recorded for. It was the record label. If I'm not mistaken, John McCormick and Al Jolson and the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and eventually Jelly Roll Morton and Duke Ellington. But I mean, it was the major label at that time. And so that's Benny Moten's band. On the bottom left, we have George E. Lee's orchestra. And George E. Lee was a wonderful band leader who had a band that included at one point the saxophonist Bud Johnson, who's going to come up as a very significant person in Ben Webster's life in a little bit. His sister Julia Lee played piano and sang, and they had quite a reputation, made records, and they were also very popular. And on the right, another band that was nationally popular because of their radio broadcasts and also their recordings, and that was the Coon Sanders Orchestra. And one has to say that the Coon Sanders, those were the last names of the two leaders of the band, Joe Sanders and I forgot the name of Mr. Coon there. Let me see what his name was. But they were the famous band there. Carlton Coon played the drums, and pianist Joe Sanders. And there they are. Man, what is that? Jesus. Look at that bass thing or guitar thing. I know that in years later, Israel Crosby played something called the basso guitar, but that's not that. That is something else. And I'm sure right now there's probably maybe Nick Rossi or someone who's listening out there would know what the heck to call that. But and there's another interesting, maybe a guitar. Well, I don't know the names of them, but the bass and the guitar, if you look, they're really eccentric instruments for the 1920s, and a banjo, and that's really interesting. Well, anyway, the Coon Sanders Band and the George E. Lee Orchestra and Benny Moten's band were just three of the bands that were big in Kansas City. And this sound was getting in Ben Webster's ear, and he eventually wanted to play the saxophone. And he eventually left Kansas City with his parents' permission. The band leader said that he would keep an eye out for Ben. And Ben left and started traveling and went to a number of places, eventually winding up in Amarillo, Texas. And that's where the next chapter of his life really gets going in 1928. But here's just a map. This was kind of interesting to show how Kansas City, in terms of the railroad, was the, kind of really like the hub. Look at that. I mean, that's absolutely amazing, all the trains and how Kansas City was the center. And it also speaks to just, what an urban center it was becoming as Ben was getting into his teen years. And of course, with that urban setting and with the communication and the transportation and the money and the politics and the entertainment, there was a certain tempo in Kansas City that eventually was going to become world famous because of Count Basie's band and many other musicians who also came out of Kansas City. But if you look, there are trains that go down to Texas. Now, I actually don't think that Ben went to Texas on a train. I'm not sure. I would think he would be in a car with the band. There's a one that goes down to Austin, Texas there. But it shows the distance. And actually, here's a map, actually, showing how far Kansas City, Missouri is from Amarillo. And it's, well, depending on how you drive. Of course, I'm sure those roads were not available in 1928. I can only imagine what it would have been like driving in one of those cars at that time. But anyway, it's roughly 600 miles. And, it's funny, not being that much of a cartographer myself, I imagined that it was, Kansas City to Amarillo, Texas would be, even further than that. But it's still quite a jaunt. And it's in Amarillo, Texas, that the next real chapter in Ben Webster's life starts, because he was just started playing the saxophone. Wanted to play the tenor, I believe, started on the alto. But, it takes time to get your act together when you pick up a new instrument. And it was in Amarillo that he met actually a musician who had been based in Kansas City, but they met in Amarillo, and that was the saxophonist Bud Johnson. And Bud is on the left there. It's a picture from the 1940s, but he always looked young, so it's probably kind of what he looked like when he met Bud. And he's just about the same age. And he met, Ben and Bud met in Amarillo, as I said. And Bud was already kind of much more developed in terms of listening to saxophone players and to what was happening in jazz. It's at the vantage point of, almost 100 years. It's just worth remembering that, everything was so new in those days. The Hot Five records were just being made. Louis Armstrong and the Hot Five, 1926, 1927, 1928. Bix Beiderbecke was recording some things. Earl Hines would be recording some solos. Ellington was just getting going. Fletcher Henderson's band was kind of warming up into their first post-Louis Armstrong masterpieces. Fats Waller was starting to record some piano and organ music. Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters. It was all new, and it's always just so interesting to reflect that, Ben Webster didn't have a Ben Webster to listen to when he was growing up. The thought about about evolving into a career as a jazz saxophonist that people would go to Carnegie Hall to listen to. I can't imagine that was in anyone's mind. They all played in dance bands, and some were artists and some had great ambition. But again, just looking forward at history, just to think of what reality was like for them at that time, and these early connections were so important. Well, he met Bud Johnson, and Bud already had what were considered to be the hip records of the time for saxophone. And besides, Coleman Hawkins is playing with Fletcher Henderson's band, and Hawkins was still evolving at that point. He was far from his mature style. Frankie Trumbauer had already played some wonderful things on records with Bix Beiderbecke and with Paul Whiteman and Gene Goldkett. He played the C melody saxophone, and his solo on Singin' the Blues, which was recorded in 1927, was kind of like the state-of-the-art jazz saxophone solo of that era. And not only did Lester Young and Eddie Barefield and Benny Carter and Johnny Hodges and Toots Mondello and so many great saxophone players know it by heart, but Bud Johnson knew it by heart and turned Ben on to it. And this is interesting because of the next saxophone player that Ben is going to meet. But he was introduced to Frankie Trumbauer, and that whole idea of a legato, melodic, not choppy way of playing the saxophone happened that early on. While he was in Amarillo, Ben eventually made a living playing for silent movies, playing the piano. And back in those days, that was a very, very common thing. Well, The Jazz Singer came out in 1927. Sound movies really didn't become nationally, available everywhere, especially in smaller places like Amarillo. For a couple of years, it took time for the new sound technology to get out. So there were still a lot of silent films in 28, 29. And Ben played stride piano, where they would look at the film and try and accompany it. So that's kind of interesting to think about him doing that. Ben wrote a few tunes in his life named for people, not that many, but just a few. And he wrote a tune for Bud Johnson to commemorate that wonderful time they had together when they were both very, very young. And the record's called Ben Webster and Associates. It was recorded in 1959. Strongly recommended if you haven't heard it. I mean, there's some wild and beautiful Ben, along with Coleman Hawkins and Bud Johnson, and a rhythm section with Jimmy Jones, Les Spann on the guitar, Ray Brown and Joe Jones on the drums. And if you look at the record label on the right, you'll see that he named the first tune after Coleman Hawkins, Young Bean, because Bean was Coleman Hawkins' nickname. And it was the Young Bean that really was eventually Ben's biggest early influence on the saxophone. And then Bud Johnson, just a tune called Bud Johnson. And again, it's a wonderful record, and it commemorates that early friendship. Now, watch what happens next. While Ben is in Amarillo, Lester Young's father comes through. They're based in Albuquerque. And Lester Young's father, Willis Young, Billy Young, is on his way to hire another musician. I think it might have been a pianist, I'm not sure. And Ben says, well, in fact, he might have hired the pianist that Ben was playing with. I'll have to look in those biographies and double check that. But the point is that Ben tells Mr. Young that he'd like to join the Young family band. He'd like to learn more about the saxophone. Billy Young was a teacher. He played all the instruments, and he said yes. So Ben Webster went to Albuquerque and joined the Young family band. And the Young family band already had a bunch of saxophone players, including Irma Young played the saxophone, little Lee Young played the drums and played the saxophone. Lester's mother, an aunt, in fact, you can see one of them holding a saxophone on the left in that photo, but Lester was the star already at that time. And there is Lester. If you've never seen this photo, I put a circle around Lester, who's holding a tenor saxophone. A lot of people think that he didn't play the tenor until he was slightly older, but there he is. And his father is the gentleman with the cap, with the like the policeman's hat on, or band leaders, maybe Sousa kind of hat on, right next to him. And this photo was taken a little bit earlier, but it was just a couple of years later that Ben joined the Lester Young family band. He was not there that long, but he said that, Lester taught him how to play the saxophone, or not, schooled him to get better. They would practice together, play together. And so Ben got to hear like a really phenomenal guy the same age, just about 19 or 20 years old, play. And it was the young Lester Young, which is so absolutely fascinating. There's a story that Ben also tells that they used to go swimming in the river down there. And one time Lester and Lee went in, and Lester was, what's the word, flounder. Well, flounder's a fish, but he was struggling in the water, and Ben jumped in and saved him. And we just think, what would have happened to saxophone playing if Ben Webster hadn't saved Lester Young's life? So that's an interesting little anecdote there, but nonetheless, fascinating short chapter in Ben Webster's young life. We move next to the first higher class professional band that Ben joined in 1930. He was with a couple of bands and eventually graduated to this group, Jap Allen's band. And the pianist was someone who would become a major figure before his untimely passing from tuberculosis in 1945, and that's the pianist Clyde Hart. And if you look at the piano, there's Clyde Hart, and he's looking at the other musicians, and there's Ben right next to him. Ben is to the right. I don't know how large your screen is that you're looking at, but they wrote the names of the musicians there above them. And there's Ben next to Clyde Hart, and supposedly they were very, 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 very close friends. And they didn't record together that much. They're on a Lionel Hampton record session or two, and then famously a wonderful small group session done with Hot Lips Page in 1944. But Clyde Hart was a very influential figure. He was an arranger, wrote some tunes, and a wonderful pianist, and by all accounts, very harmonically adroit and very up to date. Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker famously used him on one of their very, very first record dates back in 1945, right before he passed away. Clyde Hart is also on the first small group record that Charlie Parker ever made after he was in New York. A fascinating musician. So it kind of makes sense that he and Ben were friends, because one thing about Ben is that he was going to evolve into a very harmonically advanced style. Now, as we get into the mature Ben Webster, he was never what you call like a speed demon on the saxophone. He could play fast. He could play anything that he needed to play perfectly. But sometimes when we think of players who are more harmonically advanced or more into advanced concepts, we tend sometimes to think of faster. But Ben Webster, rhythmically and harmonically, was very, very hip and very advanced in his own way. And so it makes sense that he would hook up a special friendship with a pianist, with someone like Clyde Hart. Jap Allen's band, and another band also that Ben was in, eventually disbanded. I mean, this is the beginning of the Depression. This is 1930. The Depression started in October 1929 and really didn't really hit until 31, 32, 33, when things really went down. But there's Ben, so he would be 20, 21 years old in that picture, a newcomer still on the saxophone, but obviously he had something going. And he wound up in a band with some pretty great musicians. Well, this band, part of the band, was eventually hired by the very famous band leader Calloway. Now, you might be thinking of Cab Calloway, but no, it wasn't Cab Calloway. Long before Cab Calloway was famous, his sister Blanche was much better known. And as Cab Calloway grew in the 1930s, unfortunately, Blanche Calloway's career was on the descent. But she had a wonderful series of bands starting in the late 1920s, going up through the mid-1930s. Clyde Hart eventually recorded with her later on in a band with Vic Dickinson in 1934, but they made records as far back in 1931 with Ben Webster. And in just a moment, we're about to hear Ben's very first recorded solo, and well, you'll hear it for yourself. Now, here they are on the band bus, or outside of the band bus, and Ben is, I'll tell you where he is. He is, if you count Blanche, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He's seventh from the left, and he is under the letter L. He's kind of half hidden, not half hidden, but his face is obscured a little bit behind whoever he's standing next to. Now, Clyde Hart, I thought Clyde Hart was in this band, but I don't see him in the picture unless he's the second one. Not sure. But anyway, Ben is definitely in the band, and there's Blanche. Blanche was, I don't believe there's been that much scholarship done on her. There might be a dissertation, and we'll have to look that up. But she was a fascinating figure, and hipped and taught and had an example for her younger brother, Cab Calloway, to follow. And they say that a lot of the things that Cab Calloway became famous for were things actually that Blanche had thought of first. But of course, he was a great talent in his own right. So now we're going to hear the very first recording of Ben Webster, among the first recordings. He made a few sessions with Blanche Calloway's band in 1931. This is another one that I've excerpted. We'll hear a little bit of her vocal, and then we'll hear a short solo by Ben. And just remember, this guy had only been playing the saxophone for a couple of years. And here it is, the very first among the very first Ben Webster records ever recorded, 1931.
Seems everything's wrong. There's no today. There's no tomorrow. I might forgive, but I can't live without that man.
One of the very first recordings made by Ben Webster with Blanche Calloway's band. That was June 11th, 1931. And Clyde Hart was in that band. He played the piano, and some interesting people that later would really resonate in Ben's career and in important moments in jazz. The trumpet player, there were two trumpets, Joe Keys, who was the first trumpet player in the original Count Basie big band. He had been with Benny Moten, and he came to New York, and supposedly, according to Eddie Durham and others, had a drinking problem, and he never really made it. But he was a very well-respected musician. Edgar Battle, trumpeter, arranger, was also in the band. Slim Moore on the trombone, who later played, I believe, with Earl Hines and others. Clyde Hart on piano, and on the tuba, Eddie Durham's relative Joe Durham. And on the drums, a very young Cozy Cole, who would definitely have a lot to do with Ben as the years went by. So there you have Ben's first record. I think it's fair to say that unless you're a real aficionado of Ben, you wouldn't recognize it as a Ben Webster solo. And it's one of the amazing things about his career, how he kind of grew exponentially across the decade of the 1930s. Well, after leaving Blanche Calloway, he graduated to the band that, that's usually thought of as the birthplace of the Count Basie band. But the Benny Moten band has a great reputation and place in history, even if Count Basie had never become a band leader. As we mentioned before, Benny Moten had the politically connected #1 jazz band in Kansas City in the 1920s. He was connected to the Mayor Pendergast. They recorded for the Victor label. They eventually, this band that we're looking at here, got east, and in 1931 toured in New York and Philadelphia, created a sensation, only to go back to Kansas City and kind of disband because of the Depression. But they were a tremendously influential band. The arranger, Eddie Durham, wrote some wonderful scores. There's a whole history to this band that doesn't have that much to do with Ben. In a nutshell, here it is. Benny Moten's band is in Kansas City. Benny Moten himself was kind of a ragtime piano player. And although the band was jazzy, its rhythmic feel, according to Joe Jones, he would say they played on 1 and 3. And in Oklahoma City was a wild bunch of guys and a wildly swinging band led by the bassist Walter Page's Blue Devils. And they would invade sometimes Kansas City and have a battle of the bands with Benny Moten, and they were really kind of up against each other. And Walter Page's band was a much looser band that Joe Jones said emphasized 2 and 4. And it was eventually when those beats got together, that's a simple explanation, but that something started happening with this flowing 4/4 beat. And eventually Walter Page himself and all the members of his band, Jimmy Rushing, Hot Lips Page, Eddie Durham, Count Basie, all went from the Blue Devils to Benny Moten's band. And they made this tour of the East Coast, Ben Webster was in the band. They made a famous recording session in Camden in 1932 in New Jersey at the Victor Studios. Eventually went back to Kansas City, and the band broke up for internal reasons, but we won't get into any of that. This photo is a new one that I had never seen before. I found it on a Kansas City historical website, and it's the Benny Moten band just before Ben Webster joined. But if you're interested in such things, let's see. On the right, kneeling, is Bus Moten, Benny's cousin, who played the accordion and the piano. Eddie Durham is next to him. The guy in the hat with the white scarf, that's Count Basie, believe it or not. Benny Moten is standing with a white cap on, kind of in the center there. To his left is Hot Lips Page, and to his left is Jimmy Rushing. And I'm not exactly sure who's in the back. If I spend some time going back and forth with photographs, I'm sure I could mention. I think I see Jack Washington back there too. So this is the band that Ben joined with a couple of changes, and that made this famous recording session that really has a certain kind of forward flow 4/4 swing that had never existed on a jazz record before. And Ben has a solo here. The tune is Blue Room, The Blue Room by Rodgers and Hart. It was already a standard. It was already several years old at that time. And the arrangement, as I said, is by Eddie Durham. And you're going to hear the birth of what became famous as the Basie Band. But it wasn't Lester Young in this band. It was Ben Webster. And here he is. He has a solo here. Oh boy, hotter than the 45, as they used to say. Uh, well, anyway, Eddie Durham's arrangement, Eddie Barefield on the clarinet and the alto, Hot Lips Page on that trumpet solo, and Basie on the piano with those chime chords, and Ben with his characteristic B flat on the tenor with that, with that shake he does that later became, one of his trademarks. It's all there. So there you have it. Could talk about that record forever. We're going to go on for about another 15 minutes. And I want to let you know that we're going to pick up tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. And we'll just keep going with Ben Webster. I mean, you're going to hear by the end of this Ben Webster series, Ben Webster and Dexter Gordon, a recording that I believe is unissued, that is unbelievable. Ben Webster featured on the clarinet. I don't know if you know, but he played pretty good clarinet. Pretty good. No, but he played pretty good clarinet. Very good clarinet, actually. We got all kinds of great things. So if you'll tell your friends about this, and I also want to put in a plug here for the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. Even before the current situation, all 501c3s and not-for-profits need your support. And I'll just make this very quick. But if you're not a member of the museum, or if you'd like to support it in any way, and I know some of you already do, I'd like to urge you to go to our website. Just follow the links on the Facebook page and think about supporting in some way, because none of this stuff comes for free. It's a labor of love, but none of it comes for free. And there's a whole staff here and a board and things like that that make all of this possible. Okay, to continue, Benny Moten, 1932. Ben is in the band, and he goes back to Kansas City. And Kansas City is now, partially because bands are falling apart and guys are coming back to look for gigs, a whole bunch of switching around starts to happen with the saxophone players. Lester Young is in and out. Herschel Evans is in and out. Ben and a whole bunch of other people, whose names don't get called that often, but man, there's a lot of great saxophone playing happening in and around Kansas City. And a famous thing happens in late 1933, and Ben Webster's there. And it's funny, he's usually not talked about as having been there because it's such a classic encounter between Ben Webster and Lester Young. Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young. But Ben Webster was there that night. He played. Herschel Evans was there that night. He played, and others. And the short version of the story is Fletcher Henderson's band, which was the band. I mean, Ellington had a great orchestra that was such a special, unique thing. It wasn't in the same league as the other bands for musicians. It was a different thing. But there was McKinney's Cotton Pickers and Fletcher Henderson's band, Charlie Johnson's band, the Casa Loma Orchestra among the white bands in this era, really great orchestras. But Fletcher Henderson's band was kind of the one that if you could play in that band, it was like getting your doctorate degree in that world, because Fletcher's music was not only difficult, but it was written in unusual keys, in D major and B major and G sharp and I don't know what. And when you played, it was even harder when you played the saxophones or trumpets, because you had to transpose, you were playing in other key signatures. And one of the people who was in Fletcher Henderson's band said it was funny, when he got out of Fletcher Henderson's band, he had trouble playing in the key of C, which is funny because that's one of the easiest keys to read music in, but he hadn't seen C major in 3 years. Anyway, the fact that Ben eventually would wind up in that band was really something amazing. But getting back to Ben and the saxophonist at the Cherry Blossom, Fletcher Henderson's band was on tour in the fall of 1933. They came through Kansas City. Lester Young, who was already known to be kind of like the baddest guy out there at that point, went to see Fletcher Henderson's band because he wanted to see Coleman Hawkins in person. Coleman Hawkins wasn't there, but his saxophone was there and his clarinet. They, the band people would set those things up. And he went up and he actually played Coleman Hawkins' saxophone and clarinet and went back to his job. Well, eventually when Coleman Hawkins showed up, the guys in the band really knew how to get his goat because he was a very competitive kind of saxophone player. And they said, boy, that Red Young, that's what they called him back in those days. So he played the clarinet, he played the saxophone, he played all your music. He was really great. Well, the band left Kansas City, came back, I believe in November, if I'm not mistaken. And Coleman Hawkins was looking for Lester Young to have a jam session because Coleman Hawkins was famous for vanquishing all the saxophone players wherever he went. Well, Herschel Evans, Ben Webster, Lester, and Hawk, they all jammed that night. And the story goes that they jammed through the early morning hours up until, 6 a.m. or something like that. And Lester Young just wouldn't give up and kept coming back at Coleman Hawkins. And it was the first time that Coleman Hawkins had been bested in a jam session. Well, what happened was, shortly thereafter, Coleman Hawkins left and went to England in early 1934. And who did Fletcher Henderson hire to take his place? Lester Young. But Ben Webster was going to play a large role in that whole thing, and we're going to get to that right now. This is a highly edited excerpt where you will get to hear on the same tune Lester Young, Ben Webster, and Coleman Hawkins. And it is excerpted and edited from the Sound of Jazz broadcast. This is a very famous piece, Fine and Mellow, with Billie Holiday. And it's edited so you will just hear Billie sing a bit and then the three saxophones kind of back to back. And just to place Ben Webster in perspective, there are not many saxophone players that you would want to hear play at the same time as Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young in that context. Yes, there are many great saxophone players, but that's a pretty high bar of individuality. And Ben is just as individual. When he was in the Benny Moten band, and I heard this firsthand from Eddie Durham, they said that Ben was so enamored of Coleman Hawkins at that early stage that he tried to look like him, he dressed like him, he stood like him, like idol worship as a young musician. And eventually Eddie said that the guys in the band said to Ben Webster, okay, you're Coleman Hawkins, but when are we going to hear Ben Webster? And it was at that point that Ben really started to find his own style. And many times he's listed among the Coleman Hawkins influenced tenor players. But I'll tell you, he may have started out like that, but by the time he gets to his mature style, he's as different from Coleman Hawkins as Lester Young is. He really is. Anyway, let's hear now a highly edited version, so you know up front, Billie with Ben Webster, Lester Young, and Coleman Hawkins, and then we'll have Ben come back so we can make the comparison one more time.
My man don't love me. He treats me oh so mean. My man, he don't love me. He treats me awful mean. He's the lowest man that I've ever seen.
Oh boy. So there you have it. Three tenor players who met up at the Cherry Blossom in Kansas City in 1933. And there they are, what, 24 years later? Lester, Hawk, and Ben Webster. Wow. As we start to head towards home base here, as we say, we're now going to tell how Ben Webster has something to do with the Lester Young with Fletcher Henderson story. So Coleman Hawkins leaves for Europe, and Fletcher Henderson has to find a replacement. And instead of hiring one of these people who love Coleman Hawkins and who can somehow bring that to bear, he hires the complete antithesis of Coleman Hawkins, except in his absolute originality, and hires Lester Young. Lester has a miserable time in the band. He's only there for a short time and leaves. He's not fired. He quits and tells Fletcher Henderson that he just really can't take it anymore. The guys in the band are making him feel uncomfortable, but he wants a letter from Fletcher saying that he wasn't fired. So he's going to go back to Kansas City. Well, he takes Ben Webster's place in Andy Kirk's band. So here's a photo of the Andy Kirk band in 1934, early in the year. And there's Ben. He's the saxophone player in the middle on the left. Andy Kirk is behind him holding the white, with the white jacket on, the white dinner jacket. And Ben Thigpen on the drum. He's Ed Thigpen's brother. To the right of Ben, as we look at it, is John Williams, who was Mary Lou Williams' husband. The other saxophone player in front of Mary Lou is John Harrington. And if you've not spent time with the Andy Kirk band, he's a very interesting clarinet soloist. Some people hear some Lester Young in him, and Lord knows, where he got what he got. He may have had it all on his own, but he's a very cool customer and a very interesting clarinet player. The trumpet player on the right is Mouse Randolph and some other really fine musicians. And by the way, I was wrong. Andy Kirk is on the right, back by the tuba, believe it or not. That's Andy Kirk in the back. And Mary Lou Williams is on the piano. And it's worth mentioning that by Mary Lou's account and Ben's, they were quite a pair for a while there, very close in many ways, not just musically. And again, it's another one of the great pianists that Ben had a relationship with, a musical relationship. And Mary Lou, like Clyde Hart, even more than Clyde Hart, which is saying something, was an innovative arranger, pianist, composer, forward thinker about the music at that time, and undoubtedly, influenced Ben tremendously. And I'm sure she learned from Ben as well. That's really something. So Ben goes to New York. He'd probably trying to remember if he'd gone to New York with Benny Moten when they recorded in Camden. I know that they toured there in 31. They may have toured there in 32. But he goes to New York not as a member of Benny Moten's band, but being sent for by none other than Fletcher Henderson to take Coleman Hawkins's place, taking Lester Young's place, actually, but making the band happy with his more aggressive style of playing the saxophone, much more like Coleman Hawkins. And man, that's the big time. I mean, that's it. So here we go. Here he is with Fletcher Henderson. This photo was actually taken later. He rejoined the band in 1937, but it's the only photograph I could find of him and Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson, for those who don't know who he is, Fletcher Henderson, as we mentioned before, had one of the great bands of the 20s and 30s. And right around this time, was struggling with his band in 34, eventually had to give it up because there just wasn't enough work that paid enough for him to keep it together. And he wound up becoming the musical arranger, kind of almost like the musical director for Benny Goodman. And it was the Benny Goodman records that really brought Fletcher Henderson's arranging style to a wider public. But Ben was in the last great original Fletcher Henderson band. And here he is. He has a wonderful solo here. It's the Limehouse Blues, and it's arranged by someone else who is going to be so important to Ben Webster. personally and musically. And that's the great Benny Carter, who's going to have a very interesting, usually unremarked upon influence on Ben Webster. But anyway, here's Benny Carter's arrangement with Ben Webster on the tenor saxophone, Fletcher Henderson's band. Wow. Fletcher Henderson's band, that was 1934. The solos were, let's see, that was Red Allen on the trumpet and Buster Bailey on the clarinet, Ben on the tenor, Keg Johnson on the trombone. And that great band, the arrangement by Benny Carter, and that's really Louis Armstrong written out, especially when you get to those shout choruses. And also some of the Benny Moten things. If you heard some of the similarities between Eddie Durham's Blue Room and some of the other Benny Moten charts, some of the same ideas. Very interesting how things were moving there. But again, that was Ben Webster on the saxophone. Well, folks, this is the end of part one of the Ben Webster feature. I'll tell you what we're going to start with tomorrow at 3 p.m. And that will be some of the wonderful records that Ben made with Billie Holiday and Teddy Wilson and people like that in 1935. There's Ben and Billie Holiday and the other tenor player in Willie Bryant's band, Johnny Russell. And there they are. I think some people say that's Arnold Adams holding the guitar, but I'm not sure. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me here. This is the first time that I've tried this particular kind of technology and first time from the museum. I hope that you will please check out the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's live streams. We've had incredible things even in the last few weeks. In fact, even more, because we're doing more online because we can't do them in person. Solo piano recitals by Matisse Picard, some wonderful duos with all kinds of great instrumental folks. There'll be more interviews, all kinds of great stuff as we keep with our mission of presenting, promoting, and preserving jazz, and specifically jazz in Harlem and internationally jazz around the world. On behalf of my, our artistic co-directors, Christian McBride and John Batiste. Our staff, Tracy Hyder-Suffern, our executive director, Ryan Maloney, our director of education and programming, the rest of our staff, our board, our members, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Loren Schoenberg, and please take care of yourself. And I'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. right here. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.